They say to rule the world, you have to be something more than human. A god, maybe. Someone immune to fear. Someone who can't be touched by the past. But what if the most powerful man on earth was secretly a prisoner? Not in a cell made of iron, but in a prison inside his own head. This is the story of an emperor who survived watching his entire family get wiped out, only to let the ghosts of his childhood take control of the Roman Empire and drive it straight into a nightmare of paranoia and terror. Before the madness, before the terror, he was just a boy. Not an emperor, not a god, just Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. He was the son of a Roman hero. His dad, Germanicus, was basically a rock star in Rome, a brilliant general, a beloved leader, and the people's champion. And wherever Germanicus went on campaign, his family came with him. The hardened soldiers on the Rhine front grew to love his little boy, who would toddle around their camp wearing a tiny, custom-made soldier's uniform. They gave him a nickname, one that would stick with him for all the wrong reasons: Caligula, which just means little boot. For a short golden time, his childhood was everything Rome hoped for. He was the adored son of a national hero, a living symbol of a bright future. But in the Roman Empire, golden ages don't last long, and the shadows are always waiting. When Caligula was just 7, his father died. It happened suddenly, mysteriously, out in Syria. The official story was illness, but his mother, Agrippina, was convinced it was poison. And in the marble halls of power, all the whispers pointed to one man, the emperor himself, Tiberius. Tiberius was Germanicus's adoptive father, but he was also a deeply paranoid man who saw a rival around every corner. The death of Germanicus wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the systematic destruction of Caligula's entire world. His proud and defiant mother, Agrippina, squared off against the emperor, and that was a battle she could never win. The purges began. First, Caligula's 2 older brothers, Nero and Drusus, were named enemies of the state and arrested for treason. Then, his mother was taken. One by one, they were all exiled to barren islands, left to die in horrific conditions. Imagine being a kid and watching your family get dismantled like that. The people you love, branded as traitors, stripped of their dignity, and sent away to die. Every day brings a new fear, a new loss. As one historian put it, his childhood was spent amid an atmosphere of paranoia, suspicion, and murder. Caligula was the last male survivor of his family line, a single stalk of wheat left in a field that had been cut to the ground. He survived by making himself invisible. He learned to bury every single emotion: no grief, no anger, no fear. To show any feeling at all would prove he was his mother's son, and that was a death sentence. Then the summons came. In the year 31, Tiberius, the man who had ruined his family, called for Caligula to join him at his island fortress on Capri. This wasn't a kindness, it was a power move. For the next 6 years, Caligula lived side by side with his family's destroyer. He walked the halls of a palace where, according to the historian Suetonius, twisted and depraved acts were just part of the daily routine. He had to play the part of the dutiful, grateful ward, smiling and flattering the monster who haunted his every thought. How does a mind even survive that? It adapts. It learns to wear a mask and wear it so well that the mask starts to become part of the face. On Capri, Caligula became a master of playing a part. He studied the mechanics of terror and the language of absolute power. He saw how Tiberius, paranoid and isolated, ruled an entire empire through whispers and death sentences. And he learned a terrible lesson. In this world, trust gets you killed, and paranoia keeps you alive. The boy they called Little Boot died on that island. In his place was a young man waiting patiently for his jailer to die, convinced that the only way to be safe from monsters is to become one yourself. In March of 37 AD, the news everyone was waiting for finally dropped. Tiberius was dead. The Roman people, exhausted by the dark and oppressive years of his reign, went wild with celebration. And into that power vacuum stepped the last son of Germanicus. At just 24 years old, Caligula was emperor. His rise to power was met with pure joy. He was a fresh start, the return of a beloved family. The crowds cheered, the Senate gave him their full support, and the entire empire took a collective sigh of relief. And for a little while, it seemed like their prayers had been answered. Caligula's first moves as emperor were pitch perfect. He handed out bonuses to the Praetorian Guard who had put him on the throne. He recalled political exiles, people who had suffered under Tiberius, just like his own family. In a grand public gesture, he burned the records of the old treason trials, declaring an end to the paranoia. He threw lavish games and parties for the people, showering them with the kind of fun and generosity they'd been missing for years. Rome was thrilled. They had their hero's son back, and it felt like he was healing the empire's wounds. But the past doesn't get banished that easily. About 7 months into his reign, everything changed. A mysterious and severe illness struck the young emperor, something ancient writers called a brain fever that left him near death. We'll never know for sure what it was. Modern theories range from encephalitis to temporal lobe epilepsy, but whatever the cause, the result was a catastrophe. As the empire held its breath praying for his recovery, they had no idea what was coming. He recovered, but the man who emerged from that sickbed was not the same one who had fallen ill. It was as if the fever burned away the mask he had so carefully worn for years. What was left was the terrified, damaged boy from Capri, but now he was armed with absolute power. The ghosts of his past were no longer whispering. They were screaming in his head, and he started to see his enemies everywhere. The change was instant and horrifying. The paranoia he had learned from Tiberius exploded into state policy. One of his first victims was his own cousin and co-heir, Tiberius Gemellus, whom he forced to commit suicide. Next was his father-in-law, a respected man named Marcus Junius Silanus, who met the same fate. The treason trials he had so famously abolished, he brought them back with a vengeance, using them to eliminate anyone he even suspected of being a threat. The man who survived a purge was now starting his own. And then things started to get weird. He burned through the treasury on bizarre vanity projects like 2 massive new aqueducts and unbelievably decadent pleasure barges on Lake Nemi that were basically floating palaces. He started talking about himself not as a ruler, but as a god. He'd show up dressed as Jupiter, Hercules, or Apollo, demanding that senators worship him. He even built a private bridge from his palace to the Temple of Jupiter, just so he could go hang out with his fellow god as an equal. The promising young ruler was gone. The celebrated son of a hero had vanished. In his place was a man whose mind seemed to be cracking under the weight of his own history. The trauma, the fear, the lessons in cruelty. It was all bubbling to the surface. The illness might have been the spark, but the psychological dynamite had been piled up for years. He couldn't let go of his past, so he started to recreate it, and he was casting the Roman elite in all the starring roles of his personal nightmare. With the mask now officially off, Caligula's reign spiraled into a theater of cruelty, with him as the star. The paranoia that started with his inner circle spread to every corner of his rule. He trusted no one. The palace became a pressure cooker of fear. Senators were forced to kiss his feet. He'd invite them to a fancy dinner, only to have one of the guests suddenly seized and executed in the middle of the meal, before he calmly resumed eating as if nothing happened. For Caligula, terror wasn't just a tool, it was entertainment. His cruelty was deeply sadistic. He forced fathers to watch their own sons being executed, then would invite them to dinner that same night, expecting them to make pleasant conversation. He would humiliate the wives of powerful senators, pulling them away from their husbands at parties, taking them to a private room, and then returning to critique their performance in front of the whole crowd. These were calculated attacks on the honor of Rome's most powerful men, designed to prove that absolutely no one was safe from him. His ego was out of control. He officially declared himself a living god, a new sun. Temples were built for him, and priceless statues of other gods were decapitated so his own head could be sculpted onto them. He announced plans to erect a colossal statue of himself in the sacred temple in Jerusalem. An act of sacrilege so profound it nearly caused a full-scale rebellion, a crisis that was only avoided through the desperate diplomacy of his friend, King Herod Agrippa. But maybe nothing captures the sheer, bizarre nature of his tyranny like the story of his favorite horse, Incitatus. Caligula gave the horse a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and a team of servants. But then he appointed the horse a priest and, according to Suetonius, announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest political office in Rome. Whether he was truly delusional or just pulling a twisted, elaborate prank to show the senators that his horse was more worthy of power than they were, the message was clear. Reality was whatever he said it was. This divine lifestyle was incredibly expensive. The building projects, the floating palaces, and the endless games bled the Roman treasury dry. To get more cash, he turned to extortion. He used the treason trials to target wealthy citizens, then confiscated their property. He slapped bizarre taxes on everything from food to lawsuits to marriage. He even declared that every loyal citizen should leave him money in their will. If they didn't, he took their entire estate anyway. Rome was being plundered by its own emperor. His military career was just as strange. He marched his legions all the way to the northern coast of Gaul, supposedly to invade Britain. But once he had the army lined up on the beach in full battle gear, he ordered them to attack the sea itself, hacking at the waves with their swords. Then he told them to collect seashells, declaring them spoils of the ocean, plunder he had taken from the defeated god Neptune. How does a person become this? Was it just madness? Or was it the horrifyingly logical conclusion of a childhood spent in constant fear? He watched his family get annihilated by unchecked power, and in his broken mind, the only way to be safe was to become the most powerful, most feared being on earth. He wasn't just ruling. He was trying to exorcise his demons by projecting them onto the entire world. But you can only push people so far. The relentless humiliation and random executions finally broke the loyalty of the very men paid to protect him, the Praetorian Guard. The conspiracy was led by an officer named Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula had constantly mocked for having a high-pitched voice. It was a petty cruelty that would be his last. On January 24th, 41 AD, the conspirators cornered Caligula in a secluded tunnel beneath the palace. There, the man who called himself a god was met with cold, hard steel. Chaerea struck the first blow. The others swarmed in. He was stabbed over 30 times. The slaughter didn't stop there. The assassins swept through the palace, killing his wife and his infant daughter, whose head they smashed against a wall. The family line of Germanicus, which began with so much hope, was now extinguished in one final, brutal spasm of violence. The cycle that began with the murder of his family was now horribly complete. Caligula's story is a chilling look at how personal trauma can scale up into a weapon of mass destruction. These psychological deep dives reveal the hidden fractures beneath the surface of history. If you find these explorations into the darker side of power compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the minds of the figures who shaped our world. So, what is the legacy of Caligula? For centuries, he's been remembered simply as the Mad Emperor, a caricature of tyranny. But the truth is far more complex and, frankly, more disturbing. Was he born a monster, or was he meticulously crafted into one by a childhood of unimaginable terror? The debate among historians still rages. Some see clear signs of a mental illness, maybe triggered by that near-fatal sickness. Others see a man shattered by post-traumatic stress, lashing out at a world that had given him every reason to be afraid. And some argue he was a chillingly clever autocrat who used the performance of madness as a tool for absolute control. In the end, maybe the specific diagnosis doesn't matter as much as the result. Caligula's story is a terrifying case study of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a person whose soul has been broken. He survived the political machine that destroyed his family, but he could never escape the ghosts it created. They followed him from the military camps of his youth to the treacherous palace on Capri, and finally, onto the imperial throne itself. He couldn't let go of his past, and in the end, it dragged him and his world into an abyss. The most haunting question he leaves behind is not whether he was mad, but whether any of us could have survived what he did without becoming a monster too.